In this video, I'm going to demonstrate a running stitch. So I have two pieces of fabric. This is kind of boring fabric. This is just unbleached cotton muslin. I have it marked with F to designate the front because I think it's kind of hard to see on this video. I did this in Sharpie. Don't do this if you're actually trying to sew something pretty together. But for demonstration purposes, I have this marked F for front and B for back. And ditto on this piece over here. The reason I did that is because whenever you are trying to sew two pieces of fabric together and you want to have a seam that hides, you're going to sew front to front. So I've got my front, those go face to face. So what I'm looking at as I do this is actually the back side or the reverse of my fabric. Some fabrics, it's really easy to tell what the reverse is, right? You can tell what the pattern is. It often changes on the back. Like I said before, this is really boring fabric. There's not a whole lot of difference between the two, and it's pretty hard to make out on this video, so I just marked them for ease of being able to tell. Something I like to do, especially when I have a piece of fabric that's a little bit larger than this, you know, if I was working with something that was small like this, I probably wouldn't necessarily have to pin it. But I like to pin things along my seams so that I don't have to hold on to too much and keep too many things straight. So I'm just going to take a couple pins. These are ones with kind of oversized balls at the end of them. I'm just going to put a couple of pins in. I usually pin too much, but I'm just going to put a few in. The reason I usually put them this way is because I'm used to sewing with a machine, and this is something that you can often sew over your pins this way if you're using a machine, or as you feed it, you can just pull them out. So that's an old habit of mine, but I'm actually going to rotate it this way because I'm going to be sewing this way. Another thing I should point out too is that I've got my two edges. These are raw edges and that they're unfinished. You can see they're starting to fray. Right? All of these threads are coming loose. These two edges, and I'm going to put my seam right here, are matched up about as close as I can get them. This makes my life easier because I don't have to go searching for the second piece of fabric. I already know that I've matched it up. I've put my pins to hold it in place. And I like to keep things kind of orderly and tidy like that. I've already traced a line in here to help me know exactly where I want to put my stitches. You're certainly welcome to do this too. It'll help you keep your seams straight, especially when you're hand stitching. From your edge, an ideal would be to sew within about 1/8 of an inch. This is what sort of advanced quilters who are often using a machine would do. Because I'm theoretically just starting out and it might be more useful for me to be able to hold on to more, we can up that seam allowance, right? The seam allowance is how much fabric you have left between this edge and your seam. For me, I did this at about, a little over 1/4 of an inch. But if you want extra to hold on to, you could even make it 1/2 inch. That's okay. It's a pretty big seam allowance, but that's okay. Then I'm going to start sewing. So different people like to sew from left or right, depending on whether you're right or left-handed. I'm right-handed, but I learned how to sew from a left-handed person, so sometimes my directions are a little backwards. In any case, I've found that this works best for me, so this is how I'm going to show you to do it. So I like to keep my knots on the same side, right? I already have my thread prepped with a knot all the way down here at the bottom. So I'm going to insert my needle here. I'm leaving a seam allowance here on this side too, because I'm going to have to sew something to this end at some point. And then I'm going to do a running stitch. Oops, my needle just slipped out. Actually, I'm just going to go ahead and put the knot in this before I get sidetracked. Adjust my tension. You guys will see it kind of bunched up there at the end. I don't want that. I want to make sure my tension's even. And then I want to just give my needle a soft little tug to make sure that the knot stays in place. Sometimes you might end up with a smaller knot that doesn't want to stay in place. And then I'm going to try really hard to stay on this line, and I can go up and down several times to make a series of stitches. I don't want to pull this too tight or it'll gather my fabric together, which sometimes you want to do, but you don't want to today. And then I'm just going to keep going. I'm kind of using my thumbnail to guide where I want to pull the needle back out. Uh-oh, I got a big tangle. I don't ever want to keep just pulling to see what happens. So I usually like to kind of back things out. You can comb out that tangle with your needle, make sure it doesn't tangle back up. And then I want to come back and adjust the tension. Check on the other side, still good. And at this point, I can pull out that pin. With a running stitch, these are actually fairly large stitches. For a project like this, I'm hand sewing a quilt square. Ideally, my stitches would be even smaller. Remember, I'm still kind of trying to stay on that line I'd made for myself. All of these stitches are more or less the same size. Smaller stitches are a bit more secure. They're more work, right? It means you go up and down with your needle more along one row, but it does make your seam more secure. However, in the interest of consistency, I'm going to kind of keep going on more or less the same size. Stick with me for just another minute. We'll talk about finishing. So at this point, I'm at a pretty good point. I can actually take this pin out. I don't need it to hold anything in place anymore. I've looked at the reverse. Not everything is 100% consistent. That's okay. I can live with it. You'll notice that I'm nearing the edge. I probably really only have one more stitch left though, because remember, I left a seam allowance up here on this side because I'm going to want to sew something to this at some point. So I'm going to also leave a small seam allowance on this side. So I'm going to put my needle through. Right, make sure all my tension is okay. And then what I can do is I can come back up on the side. This is called a back stitch. And ideally I want to come through a slightly different part of the fabric. So I don't want it to, I don't want to wear down too much in the same spot. So I'm actually going to come up a little bit behind. That's okay. And then I have two options. I can either put another stitch in this way, which I actually think I might do, or I can do that a couple more times where I go in, come back up, in, come back up. But I'm gonna go down, come back up, and actually show you guys how to knot at the end. So this helps things just be a little bit more secure here at the end. So to put a knot at the end, where I've got my knot on this side, over here, I'm gonna try to put a knot over here. I'm gonna scoop up my previous stitch. You can see, I'm gonna scoop up my previous stitch here. I'm gonna lay this flat so you guys can see what I'm doing. I'm gonna pull this pretty close to being taut. And then I'm just gonna tie a knot in it. So I'm gonna go around the back of this loop, come back through. Oops. Make sure I don't tangle anything. And then I'm gonna hold everything in place and I can tighten my knot. So I end up with this very nice, tidy knot at the end of my seam. Then I'm gonna leave another quarter to half an inch of a tail. I don't wanna cut anything too short or else the knot will unravel itself. And voila, I have a seam. Now you can see that if I pull on this, it looks really uneven and kind of gross. That's because I took really big stitches. Right? All of these gaps in between are areas of uneven tension. So the way I'm gonna counteract that is at some point I'm gonna come in and if I have an iron, I can take my handy iron and just press this, press it flat so that my seam is off to one side. I recently heard about someone using a hair straightener as sort of an iron to press things into place. That works great too. It's the same general idea, just don't burn your fabric. And then my seam will be nice and finished out. The final note I want to leave you with on this is for hand sewing, for this particular endeavor, you'll want to leave your seams laying down to one side or the other. The way that you end up letting them rest kind of depends on your overall design. This is going to have to be a kind of a 1-by-1 choice. Usually when you're sewing, you want to take your seams and press things open, right? If you're using a sewing machine, the tension is tight enough that everything will be, very sturdy and well connected. But for something that's hand sewn, if I have this pressed open and then I go to, let's say there's some tension on this from the other side, you end up with some really ugly gapping, right? If I were sewing a quilt or if I were sewing a pillow or pincushion or whatever, I don't want to be able to see like the filling through it. So if my seam is laid off to one side, I cover up that gap and even though I might see a little bit of my thread, it's a non-issue. The final thing I want to leave you with is that I used red thread here because I wanted enough of a contrast so that you could see what I was working on. Typically what you want to do is find a thread that's closer in color to the fabric you're working with. So for me, if I were using unbleached muslin like this, I would want to use like a beige fabric or a beige thread, probably not red, although it's good for demos. So there you have it, a running stitch.